Hello. General Hospital today will review Willow was once praised as a beacon of light amidst the swirling shadows of Port Charles, a devoted nurse, a loving mother, and a loyal wife who had seemingly endured more than her fair share of tragedy and heartbreak. To the outside world, she embodied compassion, resilience, and quiet strength. But that light, once revered and admired, has now revealed itself to be a deceptive facade. Beneath it lurked a calculating mind and a heart hardened by bitterness and ambition. It wasn't an overnight transformation, nor was it the result of a single devastating event. It was a gradual corrosion of conscience, a slow but relentless descent into darkness, masked by soft smiles and kind gestures. And the unraveling of this facade began the moment Drew Kane, war hero, Corinthos loyalist, and father, collapsed without warning from a mysterious stroke. He had been healthy, strong, and in the middle of a heated family dispute, only to fall suddenly and violently into a critical medical state. The only person present at the time? Willow. She was the first to respond, the first to administer aid, and the last to touch the medications that were supposed to stabilize him. The hospital praised her swift action, and Michael, unaware of the shadows now growing in his wife's eyes, held her close in gratitude. But Diane Miller, one of Port Charles's sharpest legal minds, was not so easily persuaded. Years of defending the innocent and exposing the guilty had sharpened her instincts, and those instincts were now screaming that something didn't add up. She watched Willow carefully, how she rushed to shut down any questions about Drew's sudden collapse, how she brushed off inconsistencies in the medical charts, and how she seemed too eager to volunteer as Drew's primary caregiver. There was something in her tone, an edge, a subtle control that made Diane look again. Without fanfare or warning, Diane began her own private investigation. She requested Drew's medical files under legal pretense, quietly analyzing timelines, dosage records, and treatment protocols. What she found was disturbing. A prescribed dosage that shouldn't have been lethal had suddenly become catastrophic, and the medication logs had been overwritten in the system by someone with high-level clearance. Diane combed through hospital surveillance and found a series of missing timestamps. After some digital forensics, one hidden clip was recovered. In it, Willow entered Drew's private room holding a syringe, her face calm, her movements practiced. Minutes later, the monitors went wild. It was no longer a question of doubt. It was proof of intent. Diane's heart sank. She had known many villains in Port Charles, mobsters, manipulators, and madmen, but Willow had always stood apart, the trusted figure of grace and empathy. The image of her standing over Drew's bed with a needle shook Diane to her core. Not because of the act itself, but because of the deception. Willow had worn virtue like a cloak, using it to shield her true nature. Behind that carefully cultivated image was a woman capable of cold, methodical harm, and Diane now knew that the soft-spoken healer was nothing more than a master manipulator. What made her worse was the victim, Drew, a man who had risked everything for his family. He had been more than just a target. He had been a symbolic obstacle in Willow's twisted game. Her need to control Michael, to silence anyone who could sway him, had now crossed into attempted murder. Faced with the truth, Diane knew she had to act, not just for Drew, but for Michael, who was being emotionally ensnared by a woman capable of monstrous acts. She gathered every shred of evidence, video footage, hospital logs, falsified prescriptions, and approached Michael not with suspicion, but with certainty. She didn't plead or speculate. She showed him. And as Michael stared in silence, the foundation of his life began to collapse. The woman he had protected through cancer treatments, held through loss, and built a future with, was not a victim of circumstance. She was the architect of destruction. Willow had weaponized her medical training, manipulated legal systems, and exploited family vulnerabilities, all to maintain control over a narrative where she alone stood in the light. But now that light had gone out. The impact on Michael was immediate and devastating. He couldn't reconcile the image of his wife reading bedtime stories to their children with the woman Diane had just revealed. His heartbreak was magnified by the knowledge that Willow had not only harmed Drew, but had manipulated Michael's loyalty as a shield to evade suspicion. Everything they built, their home, their family, their hopes for the future, now felt like a carefully constructed lie. Michael's trust had been weaponized, and his love had become a tool in Willow's hands. He withdrew, unable to speak, unable to understand how the woman who once wept in his arms could now be capable of such cruelty. But Willow, ever perceptive, began to notice the shift. The way people at General Hospital hesitated before speaking to her. The closed-door meetings. The absence of warmth in Michael's touch. And then came the final blow. She was summoned to a formal hearing. Her license to practice medicine suspended pending investigation. It was then she knew Diane had acted. And the walls were closing in. Willow's veneer began to crack. She tried to play the victim, claiming stress and emotional collapse, painting herself as overwhelmed and misunderstood. But the evidence was damning. Public opinion turned swiftly and viciously. Michael refused to defend her. Carly went cold. Even Brooklyn, once a friend, refused to meet her gaze. And Drew, now slowly recovering and piecing together fractured memories, gave a quiet statement confirming the truth. The court case that followed was swift and brutal. Diane, composed and relentless, presented her case not with vengeance but with justice. She painted a picture of a woman who had lost her moral compass, who had embraced manipulation and violence to hold power over the people she claimed to love. Willow, once seen as a survivor of grief and cancer, was now framed as a predator cloaked in compassion. Her sentencing was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Stripped of her license, publicly disgraced, and facing a lengthy prison term. Willow was no longer the darling of Port Charles. She was a cautionary tale. A reminder that darkness doesn't always announce itself with thunder. It sometimes arrives in silence. Wrapped in white scrubs and gentle smiles. As the cell door closed behind her, Willow sat in silence. The sounds of Port Charles continued outside, laughter, traffic, life, but in her world there was only stillness. She had tried to rewrite her destiny through deceit, but the truth had clawed its way to the surface. Diane had seen what others refused to. And Michael, though shattered, had been freed from a lie that could have consumed him. What remains now is a void, where trust once lived, and the ruins of a life Willow tried to control through shadows. And in those ruins, justice finally took root. As Michael grappled with the rising tide of betrayal and the crushing weight of responsibility, his world teetered between disbelief and duty. Everything he thought he knew about Willow had been upended. And yet, while he drowned in questions and silence, Willow continued to maintain her meticulously crafted role as the devoted caregiver. With unwavering efficiency, she brought Drew home from the hospital, organized his medications with clinical precision, prepared balanced meals, and charted his blood pressure readings as if nothing had changed. She hovered with a calculated tenderness, checking every detail of his recovery. Not out of compassion, but to ensure that he remained disoriented, that his fragmented memories of the incident wouldn't reassemble into truth. Her eyes never strayed far from his expressions, studying them for signs of recollection. It was all a performance, a chilling extension of control masquerading as care. What Willow didn't know, however, was that her performance was on the verge of collapse. Behind the scenes, Diane had not only gathered damning evidence, she had already put her plan into motion. In a closed-door emergency meeting with Alexis Davis, her longtime confidant and a woman whose legal judgment once favored Willow, Diane laid everything bare. She presented copies of tampered medical records that showed irregularities in Drew's treatment. Then came the audit logs, proof that someone had accessed and overwritten critical health data in the system under Willow's login. Finally, in the forensic toxicology report, it confirmed that the medication injected into Drew's bloodstream had been substituted for a paralytic agent, one that mimicked the symptoms of a massive stroke. Alexis, known for her pragmatism and fierce defense of the vulnerable, could only sit in stunned silence. The evidence was irrefutable. All her prior efforts to give Willow the benefit of the doubt now rang hollow. The woman she had once defended was no longer a victim or a struggling soul, she was a calculated threat. Back at General Hospital, the shift in energy surrounding Willow became impossible to ignore. She began to sense the subtle, chilling alienation that spread like a virus through the corridors. Nurses who once greeted her with warmth now averted their eyes. Colleagues whispered in corners, their glances sharp with suspicion. Phone calls she used to receive with regularity were no longer returned. Brooklyn, once a source of quiet camaraderie, avoided her altogether. And Michael, his silence was the most deafening of all. He no longer touched her shoulder in passing, no longer lingered for evening conversations. Every word he spoke felt like a placeholder devoid of affection or trust. Willow, instinctively aware that the ground was shifting beneath her, sought comfort in the one person who had once been her nemesis, Nina Reeves. It was a desperate move, but in her unraveling state, Willow had few choices. Nina, ever the opportunist and now strangely empathetic, allowed the visit. There behind closed doors, Willow feigned vulnerability. She spoke of being overwhelmed, of feeling emotionally burdened by Drew's condition, and confessed to moments of regret, strategic, selective regret. But not once did she admit to her crime. She portrayed herself as a woman cornered by circumstance, someone trying her best in a world that constantly took from her. To Nina, she painted herself as the misunderstood mother, wife, and nurse whose intentions were good but misjudged. And Nina, flattered by the confession and eager to believe she had earned Willow's trust, played into the role of a confidant. Yet what Nina didn't see was that even in this moment of supposed honesty, Willow's heart remained infected with bitterness. In the darkest recesses of her thoughts, Willow still harbored resentment towards Scout and Danny. These children, innocent in their own right, were thorns in her perfect vision of a family. They symbolized legacy, power, and emotional bonds that Willow could never fully claim. Scout, as Drew's daughter, was a constant reminder of everything Willow had tried to erase. Danny, the son of Sam and Jason, represented another lineage that diluted her influence over Michael and the Corinthos family. In her warped rationale, Willow saw them not as children but as obstacles, barriers to control, affection, and status. And her fury at them only deepened as her own walls began to crumble. The breaking point came swiftly. The moment Diane's sealed report reached the hospital administration and the local authorities, it was only a matter of time. Rumors erupted first, then tension, and finally confrontation. Willow, sensing the mounting pressure, made a reckless and fatal move. She arrived unannounced at Diane's home under the pretense of clearing the air. What followed was a volatile mix of pleading, persuasion, and thinly veiled threats. Willow begged Diane to reconsider, argued that the evidence was misunderstood, attempted to appeal to her compassion, then pivoted into veiled threats about professional consequences and personal vendettas. But Diane had prepared for this. Every word of the exchange had been recorded. Every line, every shift in tone, documented, cataloged, admissible. Diane's expression never faltered. With steely resolve, she handed over the last piece of evidence to Commissioner Jordan Ashford, who had been working quietly alongside her to corroborate the case. The trap was set, and Willow walked into it blindly. Later that evening, as she slipped on her lab coat in the hospital staff lounge, readying herself for another night shift, the doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers entered, their faces grim. Around them, the staff froze. Whispers turned to silence. Michael stood just beyond the glass wall, arms folded, his face unreadable. Brooklyn stood beside him, eyes wide but hard. Drew, recovering but now lucid, had been wheeled to the hallway to witness the arrest. Willow's breath caught in her throat. As the officers approached reading her rights, she erupted into screams, denials, accusations, wild flailing. She insisted she was being framed, that someone was out to destroy her. But no one moved. No one stepped forward to defend her. The woman who had once commanded admiration now stood in disgrace, her hands cuffed, her cries echoing off sterile walls. The silence from Michael was absolute. Not a word. Not a glance of mercy. Drew turned his face away. Even Nina, hearing the news from a nurse moments later, simply closed her eyes in resignation. The truth had prevailed, and Willow's reign of manipulation had come to an end, not with a confession, but with a fall so public and complete that even the most charitable heart could no longer deny what she had become. And as the elevator doors closed behind her, taking her down